Throughout the first year of the Civil War, the initiative had ebbed and flowed, from battles in places like Fort Henry, Pea Ridge, and Shiloh in the west, to Manassas, Ball's Bluff, and Hampton Roads in the east. And the armies of the Union possessed a considerable advantage of men and material, but in the Eastern Theater they were unable to capitalize on that advantage and defeat the Confederate forces. But the Union Army of the Potomac, by the fall of 1861, had a confident, new young general. Major General George Brinton McClellan was given command of the army after the disaster of the First Battle of Bull Run, fought that previous summer. McClellan was born in Philadelphia in 1826 and was graduated second in his West Point class of 1846. A veteran of the Mexican War, he was an overachiever his whole life. At the outbreak of the war, he was a successful railroad manager, a career he left to serve the Union. At 35 years of age, he was elevated to command of the Army of the Potomac by Lincoln to help put an end to the rebellion. He was a great manager and organizer, and fashioned the defeated Union Army into one of the finest in the world. In stark contrast, his field command during the war was marked by personal paranoia and lost opportunities. McClellan lacked the tools that all great field commanders need. He was wanting in the aggressiveness and insight that is necessary to be successful in battle. And by the summer of 1862, the smaller Army of Northern Virginia chased him off the Virginia Peninsula. He was then put on the sidelines by Lincoln while portions of that same army were defeated at the Second Battle of Bull Run, while under the command of General John Pope, in August of 1862. But George Brinton McClellan would yet have one more chance to face his nemesis, the Confederate General Robert Edward Lee. By the summer of 1862, the 55-year-old Lee had gone from a somewhat unknown commodity in the South to its most celebrated general. Lee personified the antebellum idea of the Southern gentleman. Confederate President Jefferson Davis placed him in charge of the Army after its previous commander, Joseph Johnston, was severely wounded at the Battle of Seven Pines in May. He renamed it the Army of Northern Virginia. The bold and aggressive Lee at once seized the strategic initiative and labored for the rest of the war to hold on to it. Lee was born in Virginia into one of the most notable families of the country. He also graduated second in his West Point class of 1829, and like McClellan, he also served in the Mexican War. A soldier all his adult life, his pre-Civil War career was an extraordinarily distinguished one. Lee was offered command of all the Union armies at the outbreak of the war, but he decided to go with Virginia when she left the Union. In the spring and summer of 1862, he drove McClellan off the peninsula, and then moved his army north to thrash Pope at Second Bull Run. By September 1862, McClellan was in overall command again. He reorganized his army and tried to guess Lee's next move. However, Lee was not going to wait for his timid opponent. He was headed north to threaten Maryland and Pennsylvania. Lee's hope was that this would draw the Army of the Potomac out of the Washington defenses and into the open, where it could be destroyed. The political situation was also in a state of flux during this second summer of the war. In the South, President Jefferson Davis was trying to form 11 independent-minded states into a nation and fight a war at the same time. The South's best hope for victory was political recognition and some sort of intervention by England and France. With the stakes so very high, the Confederates placed an embargo on cotton exports to add pressure to these European governments. Ironically, this gamble helped bring about the collapse of the Confederate economy and thereby the Confederacy itself. Lee eventually convinced Davis that a successful campaign north of the Potomac would help seal a victory and bring the foreign recognition they so desperately needed. So in the late summer of 1862, Davis approved Lee's plan to invade the North. Meanwhile, in the North, President Abraham Lincoln was having problems of his own. The Army of the Potomac's consistent string of defeats was putting an incredible strain on his administration. The war, that was to have lasted only 3 months, showed no sign of ending anytime soon. And, despite some victories in the West, the country was growing weary of the conflict. Something would have to change. So that summer, Lincoln decided on a bold and inspired plan. He would emancipate the slaves. But he would do it in such a way that only those slaves living in states rebelling against the government would be freed. So, without immediately freeing a single slave, he would change the object of the war. By altering the war from one of preservation of the Union to one of slave liberation, Lincoln hoped to infuse the Northern cause with a regenerative moral power. Lincoln presented the plan to his cabinet in July of 1862, but they all agreed that the proclamation could only be issued after a Union victory. So, with the prospect of the Confederacy winning its independence larger than ever, Lincoln placed the Emancipation Proclamation in a desk drawer and waited uneasily for McClellan to bring him a victory on the field of battle.